In 1966, an Australian ship captain docked his small boat next to a deserted island called Atta. While watching the island through his binoculars, he noticed smoke rising from the trees in the forest. He was surprised, wondering how smoke could be coming from a deserted island. As he kept looking through the binoculars, suddenly a person appeared from among the trees. This person was only wearing shorts, had long hair, and looked like he was from a local tribe. When the stranger saw the boat, he started waving and shouting, then immediately threw himself into the sea and began swimming towards the boat. At this point, the captain began to feel scared, so he grabbed the steering stick that was next to the boat and got ready to face this stranger. The person reached the boat, and the captain realized he was actually a teenage boy. The boy said to him, "My name is Stephen, and there are 5 other boys with me on the island. The current dragged us here, and we've been stuck here for 15 months. Today's video talks about an incredible survival story of 6 boys whose goal was to escape from school, but they ended up lost and stranded on this deserted island. How did that happen? And how did they survive in this isolated place for all that time? That's what we'll find out in today's story. Hello, I'm Shams Aldin. Our story begins in 1965 in a country called the Kingdom of Tonga, a group of small islands in the Pacific Ocean. This area is located to the east. The heroes of our story are 6 boys, and their names are as follows: Sione, Manu, Stion, Kolo, David, and Luke. They were all students at a Catholic school, which was a religious boarding school where they not only studied but also lived. Eating, drinking, sleeping, everything was within the school. The school was very strict in its rules, which was annoying to the students because they were only allowed out for 1 day a week and under the supervision of the teachers, who were mostly monks and nuns. They treated the students very strictly, sometimes punishing them harshly if they made mistakes or didn't follow instructions. The 6 boys, who were between 14 and 16 years old, felt trapped in their situation. They always sat together and talked about a life of freedom and fun, dreaming of another world where they could do whatever they wanted. One day, while sitting during their lunch break, the oldest boy, Sione, said to his friends, "Why don't we run away?" One of them asked, "Run away where?" Sione replied, "Let's go to Fiji." Fiji was another island in the same Pacific region, but it was larger and more developed than the Kingdom of Tonga. However, it was quite far away. The boys began planning their long journey. The first thing they would need was a boat, but none of them owned one. So they decided to steal the boat of an old fisherman they had a grudge against. They figured he was a suitable target, and they wouldn't feel guilty about taking his boat. They planned for their journey to start at night, so they would have enough time to get far from the island before anyone realized they had run away. About an hour after the school's bedtime, after making sure most students and teachers were asleep, they quietly snuck out of their rooms, climbed the school wall, and escaped. They headed towards the beach, where they found the fisherman's boat that they disliked. They loaded their belongings onto the boat, lifted the anchor, and set sail. They took with them a few basic supplies like some food and fruit, and they even brought a portable gas stove to cook the fish they would catch from the sea. But not one of them thought to bring a compass or a map. The distance from Tonga to Fiji was over 750 kilometers, meaning even the smartest among them didn't think to bring the most basic tool that could help them stay on course. And in any case, even if they had brought a map or compass, a journey like this would have been almost impossible for kids who had never been to sea before. The least you could call them is reckless. About 2 hours into their journey, they were far enough from the coast, and dawn was approaching. At this point, the boys started to feel tired, especially since they hadn't slept yet and weren't used to staying up late because their school didn't allow it. It was a new experience for them to stay awake for such a long period. One by one, they slowly began to doze off until they were all asleep, with no one left awake. The boat's sail was still up, and the wind was playing with it, pushing the boat in random directions. The boys didn't wake up until the sound of thunder startled them. They were caught off guard by a storm in the middle of the ocean. They woke up terrified, and the first thing they tried to do was raise the sail, because if it stayed down during a storm, the wind would toss them around. But before they could raise it, the sail tore apart due to the intensity of the storm, as it was old and in poor condition, and it flew away. The 6 boys spent the entire storm clinging to the boat with their hands and feet to avoid being thrown into the sea. Finally, after some time, the storm passed and the weather improved. But now their situation was dire. They didn't know where they were or where the current was taking them, and they couldn't control the boat's direction anymore since they no longer had a sail. They remained like this for 8 days, tossed by the waves from place to place, just trying to survive. The food and fruit they had brought with them were gone, and their attempts to fish, which they thought would be easy, didn't work. They couldn't catch anything, and even the water they had was running out. They started collecting rainwater in coconuts they had with them, cutting them in half and using the halves as cups to gather water. They also set up a drinking schedule, where each of them would drink the smallest amount possible in drops, because if they ran out of water, it would be the end for them. Finally, after suffering for 8 days, on the 9th day, they spotted an island on the horizon. This was the first piece of land they'd seen since leaving their island. They didn't have a sail to steer the boat toward the island, so they tried paddling with their hands using anything they could find on the boat. Luckily for them, the waves were pushing them toward the island. Finally, by evening, they got close. They jumped into the sea and swam toward the shore, leaving the boat behind in the water because they had no way to pull it with them. Their anchor had broken during the journey. The boys swam to the island, and the boat drifted off into the ocean. When they reached the shore, they collapsed on the sand and fell asleep from exhaustion, not waking up until the next morning when the sun rose. And that's when their survival journey on this island would begin. A journey much longer than they had planned for. The island the 6 boys had reached was called Atta, and it had been considered deserted for over 100 years. 100 years ago, some indigenous people had lived there, numbering maybe in the hundreds, but suddenly, slave traders invaded and took all of them, selling them into slavery. No one was left, no child, no adult, no man, no woman. They kidnapped every single person from the island. Since then, the island had been abandoned. When the boys woke up from their sleep, they tried to find food and water. They made wooden spears from the trees, taking sticks and sharpening the tips with stones. They used these spears to try and catch fish, but they had no fire, so they were forced to eat the fish raw. Food was available, but they remained thirsty as they couldn't find any fresh water. So they began hunting seabirds from their nests and drinking their blood, as well as taking their eggs and drinking those. For them, any food or drink, no matter how bad, was a huge blessing and an unmatched luxury.
Any food, anything to drink.
Any food, no matter how awful it is and how dirty it is, it's a very beautiful thing to have it in that time.
During this time, the boys found some pottery and primitive knives, and even a few chickens, which was a huge find for them. They never expected to come across all these things. After that, they kept trying to start a fire. It took them a long time, several days and many attempts, until one day they managed to get a fire going by rubbing a tree branch against a piece of dry wood. Since fire was such a precious thing for them, they decided to set up a schedule to keep it going. Each of them took turns feeding the fire and adding wood during their shift. At night, they would gather around the fire in a circle, holding hands and singing songs. These were religious songs they had learned at their school. Sometimes they missed school. You don't appreciate what you have until you lose it. Every day they spent on this island, they wished they were back at the school they had done all of this just to escape from. But the boys weren't helpless. They managed to make use of everything around them, even using palm fronds to build a small hut for themselves. They set up a banana and bean farm and worked hard in an organized way. They didn't just focus on the basics, though. They even built a gym with weights and benches and created a rishin court, which was like tennis. One of them made himself a guitar using wooden planks and coconut shells. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. Since they were teenagers, arguments and problems would come up between them. But they came up with a system to deal with it. If two of them got into a fight, the rule was that each would go to opposite ends of the island for a whole day without speaking to each other. Once the day was up, they'd return to the group with a commitment not to bring up the reason for the fight, no matter what. I think that's a pretty smart method. I don't know which one of them came up with it, but even though they were teens, they acted pretty mature. Psychologically, it was really tough. Every extra day they spent on the island made them lose a bit more hope of returning to their families. But despite everything, they still had a little hope left. They even tried to build a wooden raft from the island's trees, hoping they could cross the sea. But the raft sank immediately. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise that it did, because if they had tried sailing, the ocean likely would have swallowed them up. They kept holding on, splitting tasks between them. Some kept the fire going, some tended to the animals, others took care of the farm, and one would keep watch over the ocean. These tasks kept them busy, and that probably helped them avoid falling into depression. 15 months went by while they were stuck on that island. One day, Stephen was on watch duty, standing on a high hill scanning the sea for any passing ships. That day, for the first time, he spotted a small boat passing by the island. He rushed down the hill, ran to the shore, and started signaling and shouting to the person in the boat. Then, he jumped into the sea and swam toward the boat. When he climbed aboard, he found the captain aiming a rifle at him. Stephen raised his hands and said in English, "My name is Stephen, and there are 5 other boys on the island. We've been lost here for 15 months. The captain lowered his gun and introduced himself. His name was Peter Warner, an Australian fisherman. He said he had seen smoke rising from the trees through his binoculars and was curious, so he came closer to check it out because he knew the island was supposed to be deserted. Once he met Stephen, he understood the story. After that, he gathered the remaining 5 boys, and they all boarded the boat with the captain. Peter took down their names and contacted the Coast Guard, who confirmed that these boys had been missing for over a year and had been presumed dead. Their families had even held funerals for them. It was a deeply emotional and shocking moment for Peter.
And the operator very tearfully said, "It's true. These boys were students at this college. They've been given up for dead. Funerals have been held, and now you found them." That was a very emotional moment for all of us.
Of course, when the boys realized they were actually going to go home to their families and houses, their joy was indescribable.
So you knew you were going home.
Yes,
How did that feel?
like walking through the door to heaven.
But their happiness had to wait a bit longer. When they arrived at the nearest port, they were immediately arrested. The reason? The fisherman, or the old man whose boat they had stolen, had reported them. And when they returned, he demanded the police arrest them. Imagine, even though they were just young boys, lost and suffering in isolation for 15 months, they weren't even given a chance to see their families or friends first. But the fisherman insisted. That's when Captain Peter, who had saved them, decided to help them once again. Peter was actually the son of a wealthy man in Australia, and while he wasn't rich himself, he had strong connections with some media outlets. So he reached out to an Australian channel called Channel 7 and told them, "Why don't you make a documentary about this? It's an exciting story, and it just happened." The channel was interested in the idea and sent out a crew of photographers. giving Peter a small amount as an advance. Peter took that money and paid off the fisherman for the stolen boat, and the fisherman dropped the charges. The police then released the boys. Once they got out of jail, the TV crew started filming everything from that point on. After that, Peter took the boys on his boat and sailed to the island where their families lived. Their families lived on a different island than the one the boys were stranded on. The crew filmed the moment the boys were reunited with their families after all that time, especially since their families had believed they were gone forever. There were tears, crying, and lots of emotions. It's hard to imagine what those feelings must have been like unless you've been through something similar. I mean, imagine someone you love disappears out of nowhere and you believe they're dead, only for them to suddenly come back 15 months later. How would you feel? That's something I don't think anyone can truly imagine. You'd have to actually live through it to understand. Only God knows how those parents felt seeing their kids again. Of course, the whole community threw parties and feasts. It was a big deal. After a few days, once the boys had rested and reconnected with their families, they went back to the island with the TV crew. There, they filmed the documentary, covering the events I've shared with you, to document what they had gone through. Naturally, the boys had no interest in going back to school. They worked for a while with Peter on his boat, fishing, and then each one of them went their own way in life with different careers. But to this day, one of them, named Mano, still works with Peter, and they still consider each other best friends. And that's where our story ends. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Take care.